Well, we get today another one of Matthew's harsher parables. But let's be honest, Matthew's whole gospel is pretty harsh and filled with violent judgment, which doesn't really jive with modern society. I know that myself and many preachers are very relieved that in 2 weeks we begin year B. Don't have to do Matthew anymore. Now this one is called the parable of the talents, usually, and some people interpret it as talents like talents, singing or music, dancing, That's one way. Or sometimes it's used to talk about financial management. In that case, it maybe would have been good to have this one last week. But that's one way to go. But Jesus isn't really talking about money. Money is the example he's using because everyone understands to some degree that money is important, right? So it's good to note that a talent is a form of money. And of course, parables, as always, are exaggerated versions of real life. So this is a real life situation. But 1 talent was worth 15 years of slave wages. So the master has entrusted these slaves with quite a lot of money. Whatever 15 times 5 is that I can't do in my head. So that's our parable exaggeration today. Now think of this in terms of not money, but rather the world. God made the world, right? And everything in it, the church, us, and left it for us until Jesus' return. It doesn't belong to us. We are watching over it and caring for it, or not caring for it, as the case may be. And this is what stewardship is, caring for the things that God has entrusted to us. And this doesn't just apply to the church and its buildings and contents of those buildings, but it applies to everything in our lives, our families and friends and neighbors, strangers even, people of different faiths, our homes, our money, and intangible things like God's love, mercy, and grace. Because all of these things are not ours to keep forever. We just watch over them for a while we're here. And then they get passed on to someone else. So in this story, the master leaves the slaves with this absurd amount of money, which isn't really money. It would be grace, love, God's teachings, the sacraments. It's many things. But the focus of the story is on slave number 3. Number 3 says, "Master, I knew that you were a harsh man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you did not scatter seed. So I was afraid. And I went and I hid your talent in the ground. Here, you have what is yours." Now this statement has no basis in the rest of the parable. I mean, the other 2 slaves don't say anything about the master being unkind. It seems maybe the opposite, since he gave them so much money to take care of. And the narrator doesn't tell us that the guy is unkind or anything, right? But the 3rd slave is so affected by his perception of the master that he hides the money. So this is the first time we're hearing about it. So, of course, the landowner replies, "You knew, did you, that I reap where I do not sow, and I gather where I did not scatter?" Or to interpret it a bit into my own words, like, "You think I'm so mean? Why didn't you try something? Try anything then to please me." Or, "You think I'm so mean? I'll show you mean." So this might now be a case of self-fulfilling prophecy, because the master has begun to act like the 3rd slave had previously characterized him. And this is because of fear. He's afraid, so he just doesn't try. Has that ever happened to you? It's happened to me. Or you go into a situation thinking, this is going to be terrible. I'm going to hate it. I'm going to have the worst time. And sometimes you get surprised. But a lot of the time, if you go into a situation thinking you're going to hate it, then you're probably going to hate it, right? How often does this happen with our relationship with God, and not just in our everyday lives? David Lowes writes, quote, "We imagine God primarily as an enforcer of rules and get hung up by the legalism of religion. Visualize God as stern and prone to punishment, and we come to believe that everything bad in our lives is punishment from God. We see God as arbitrary and capricious, and that's what we experience, a fickle and unsympathetic God who meets those low expectations." End quote. But if we view God in terms of grace and love and blessings, we can see it in a different way. This is what Matthew's Jesus tries to get us to see. As we shift our perspective, we can be surprised by the grace-filled moments in our everyday existence. If we imagine God to be a God of love, then most likely we will experience that love. We'll see it more. And we'll be more apt to share that with other people. And Matthew's Jesus and the parables emphasize faith in action. It's not enough to have your faith and then keep it to yourself and bury it, hide it from the world. You have to show it, act it, and live it in the world. And that's the main failing of the third servant. I think it's easier to think that when bad things happen, we are being punished. Like checks and balances, we like those. To have reasons why things happen, but a lot of times there aren't really any reasons why things happen. God isn't a God that punishes in that way. That's not my belief. It's not my perspective. If we live life with the attitude that God is harsh and punishing, then God will be to you. Then in turn, we can end up turning away from life and from God and from taking risks. If we don't ever take any risks because we're afraid, we won't experience any joy or beauty in life. And God doesn't want that for us. The third slave ends up in the outer darkness, Matthew's favorite place, the outer darkness, weeping and gnashing his teeth. But I think he was already there because he lived in fear of God instead of risking the joy that can come with a good relationship with God. And the world is a very harsh place. That's a fact. It always has been. Even though right now, to me, it seems much worse. But maybe that's just because I'm living now. We had more mass shootings again. More abuse of power. More greed, hatred, destruction of the earth. More using religion and bad theology to justify all sorts of horrible crimes and abuses. So what can we do about it? What are we supposed to do? Shrug our shoulders and just say oh well, people are terrible. No, of course I'm not going to tell you to do that. Then we definitely would be like the third servant. Our faith is in ourselves and it's in our voices. We have to speak out against these harsh realities of life and try to change things and speak out against these horrible things that humans continue to do to each other. Not in judgment or returning hate for hate, but in love and friendship and reason and compassion. If we don't do this, we're not fulfilling Jesus' command to love God and love our neighbors, right? We aren't caring for the world that we've been given. Excuse me. Life in itself is a gift from God. And God's grace is what sustains us and gives us strength and life. So we need to use that strength for good, because God is love, not fear. And God is compassion, not condemnation. God is justice, not judgment. That's the God that we call Master. So, we should try to be like the first two servants and go tell the rest of the world all about it and multiply God's love on the earth, not burying it in a hole in the ground. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.